Good evening, quiet listeners, and welcome. Welcome to this quiet space, this sanctuary we have created, far from the noise and hurry of the waking world. Tonight, we seek solace not in fiction, but in the hushed and often overlooked corridors of history. Our journey this evening will not take us to the great and thundering battlefields that so often define our understanding of the past. We will not stand amidst the roar of cannons, the clash of steel, or the proclamations of triumphant generals. Instead, our voyage takes us to a place where the most consequential battles were fought in profound silence. A place where the turning points of a global conflict were decided not by force of arms, but by the quiet, relentless power of the human mind. We travel to a place where victory was measured in the soft rustle of paper, the faint scratching of a pencil, and the steady, rhythmic clicking of intricate machine. Imagine, if you will, a tranquil pond. Its surface is still, reflecting the quiet grey of an English sky. Now, imagine a single, almost imperceptible tremor beneath its surface. A thought, an idea, a whispered secret. That tremor, small as it is, sends out ripples, spreading slowly, silently, across the water, traveling further than the eye can see, until they reach the distant shores of a vast and turbulent ocean, where they grow into waves capable of altering the course of great iron ships, of saving countless lives, of changing the very tide of history itself. That quiet pond was a place, and that place was called Bletchley Park. Tonight, we step through the gates of that unassuming country estate. We walk together into a world shrouded in secrecy, a world that for decades did not officially exist. We will explore the lives of the men and women who inhabited this secret world, who waged a silent war of intellect against a seemingly insurmountable challenge. Their names were not etched onto monuments, their faces were not printed in newspapers, but their work, carried out in the utmost secrecy, was arguably one of the most critical contributions to the Allied victory in the Second World War. Our purpose here is not to dissect these events with the cold precision of an academic. Rather, it is to immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of that time and place. It is to feel the damp chill of the English air, to hear the ghostly echo of forgotten conversations, and to understand the immense, crushing weight of the secrets these ordinary people were forced to carry. So, I invite you now to let go of the day's concerns. Allow the gentle rhythm of this story to guide your breathing, to soothe your mind. There are no sudden noises here, no jarring revelations. There is only the slow, methodical unfolding of one of history's greatest and most silent stories. Our journey into the secret world of the Codebreakers begins now, not with a bang, but with a whisper, carried on the quiet country air. Our story begins not with a person or an event, but with a place. A sprawling, grand and somewhat confused-looking country mansion in the heart of Buckinghamshire, England. Before it was Station X, the top-secret hub of British intelligence, it was simply Bletchley Park, a name that evoked images of weekend hunting parties, garden teas, and the slow, predictable life of the English gentry. The mansion itself was a testament to the eclectic tastes of a bygone era. It was a rambling edifice of deep, warm red brick, a collage of architectural styles that had been added and altered over generations. There were grand Victorian Gothic turrets reaching for the sky as if in solemn prayer. There were timber-framed sections that spoke of a romanticized Tudor revival and elegant, symmetrical facades that hinted at a more classical Dutch influence. It was not a place of unified design, but rather a place that had grown organically, absorbing the whims and fancies of its wealthy owners. Its walls, thick and solid, were wrapped in a heavy mantle of ancient ivy, its dark green leaves clinging fast, witnesses to decades of silent, domestic history. Surrounding the house were acres of parkland with manicured lawns, carefully tended flower beds, and a serene, glassy lake that reflected the ever-changing canvas of the English sky. It was a place of profound peace, a corner of the world that seemed immune to the turmoil brewing across the Channel in mainland Europe. It felt permanent, unchangeable, a bastion of a tranquil and ordered way of life. But the world was changing, and the encroaching shadows of war would soon fall upon this idyllic landscape. In the late 1930s, as the threat from Nazi Germany grew from a distant rumble to an imminent storm, the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, began a quiet and desperate search. They needed a headquarters for their code-breaking division, the Government Code and Cipher School, GC&CS. The requirements were specific. It had to be located a safe distance from London to protect it from the anticipated aerial bombardment, yet close enough for daily communication and transport. It needed to be situated near a major railway line and have access to robust communication links. And most importantly, it had to be unassuming, a place that would not draw attention, a place where a large and unprecedented intelligence operation could be established in complete secrecy. In 1938, Bletchley Park was purchased. The official story, for those few locals who might have noticed the transaction, was that it had been acquired by a Captain Ridley, a London financier, to be used for weekend shooting parties. It was the first of many deceptions, the first layer in what would become a complex architecture of secrecy. The transformation was gradual at first, then rapid. The first arrivals were a small, pioneering group from the GC&CS, disguised as Captain Ridley's shooting party, who came to explore their new secret home. But soon, the signs of its true purpose became undeniable. Tall wire fences, stark and utilitarian, began to appear, enclosing the once-open parkland. Military guards, polite but firm, materialized at the gates, checking the credentials of anyone who entered or left. The sprawling lawns, once home to croquet and garden strolls, soon saw the construction of simple, functional wooden huts. Hut 1, then Hut 2, then more and more, springing up like strange wooden mushrooms, a jarring contrast to the ornate Victorian grandeur of the mansion. The tranquil country estate was becoming a secure, self-contained compound. It was being remade into Station X. And then the people of Station X began to arrive. They did not come in military convoys or troop transports. They trickled in, one by one, two by two, summoned from the quiet corners of British society by letters that were both profoundly flattering and maddeningly vague. A letter might arrive at the office of a distinguished professor of classics at Cambridge, a man who had spent his life studying ancient Greek texts. It would invite him to a meeting in London where he would be asked if he was good at puzzles and if he would be willing to undertake work of national importance. No further details would be given. A similar letter might find its way to a brilliant young female mathematician, a student whose mind danced with abstract theories but who had little experience of the world outside her university. Another might be sent to a chess grandmaster, a man accustomed to thinking 10, 15 moves ahead. Yet another might go to a linguist who had specialized in German literature, or even to a debutante in London society, whose only apparent qualification was a remarkable talent for solving the cryptic crossword in the Daily Telegraph. They were a strange and brilliant assortment of individuals, a brains trust assembled from the most unlikely of places. They were the people a nation turns to when it is faced with a problem that cannot be solved by conventional means. Imagine their state of mind as they made their journey, boarding a train at Euston Station in London, travelling north, and disembarking at the small, unassuming Bletchley railway station. They would be met on the platform, not by a uniformed officer, but by a nondescript civilian who would escort them on the short walk to the gates of the park. As they passed the guards and walked down the long tree-lined drive towards the mansion, they were stepping out of the known world and into a world of shadows. They were presented with the Official Secrets Act, a document that bound them to a lifetime of silence. They were told in no uncertain terms that they were not to speak of their work or even the nature of the place itself to anyone, not to their parents, not to their spouses, not to their closest friend, not even, in many cases, to their colleagues working in the hut next door. The mansion, with its quiet gardens and its placid lake, had become their new home, their workplace, their entire world, and it had also become the fortress that would guard the nation's most vital secret. The peace of the old Bletchley Park was gone, replaced by a new kind of quiet, the quiet of intense concentration, of unspoken anxieties, and of profound, earth-shattering secrecy. To truly comprehend the monumental task that faced the inhabitants of Bletchley Park, we must first intimately understand the adversary they confronted day after day. This enemy was not a person, nor an army. It was a machine, a beautifully engineered, devilishly complex and ruthlessly efficient machine whose name has become synonymous with unbreakable codes. Enigma. From a distance, the Enigma machine possessed an almost elegant simplicity. Housed in a sturdy, unassuming wooden box, typically of oak, it was portable, rugged, and designed for use in the field. When an operator lifted the hinged lid, they would be met with a sight that seemed familiar, almost like a typewriter. A standard German keyboard with its Quirks layout sat at the front. Of it, set into a black bakelite panel, was a field of small, circular glass screens, one for each letter of the alphabet. This was the lamp board. The machine's entire purpose was contained in the interaction between these two elements. A key was pressed and a lamp would light up. But this simple interface was a masterful deception, a placid surface concealing an ocean of cryptographic complexity. The true genius and the true challenge of the Enigma lay hidden beneath that panel in its electromechanical heart. This heart consisted, most famously, of a set of rotating wheels or rotors. Imagine a thick, solid disc, like a hockey puck, made of insulating bakelite. On one face of the disc are 26 electrical contacts arranged in a circle, one for each letter of the alphabet. On the other face, there is another identical set of 26 contacts. Inside the disc, a tangled, seemingly random web of wires connects each contact on one side to a different contact on the other. This is a rotor. Now, imagine 3, 4, or even 5 of these rotors placed side by side on a spindle, each with its own unique internal wiring. When a German operator pressed a key, say the letter T, an electrical current would begin a journey. It would travel from the keyboard to the first rotor, enter at the T contact, pass through the scrambled internal wiring, and exit at a different, unpredictable contact point. From there, it would immediately enter the second rotor, where its path would be scrambled again. Then, to the third. At the very end of the rotor stack was a special, non-rotating wheel called a reflector, which would take the electrical signal and send it back on a completely new path, a return journey through all the rotors, scrambling it again at each stage, before it finally reached the lamp board and illuminated a letter, perhaps G. The brilliance of this system was that it was never static. After each single key press, at the very least the rightmost rotor would click forward by one position, 1/26th of a full rotation. This single, small movement completely changed the internal wiring configuration for the entire machine. The next time the operator pressed T, it would not become G, it might become X or L or P. The machine was a constantly evolving, self-altering labyrinth. A simple message like "Attacker Dawn" would become a nonsensical string of characters with no discernible repetition or pattern. But the complexity did not end there. The German military introduced several additional layers of security to make the puzzle even more formidable. The rotors themselves were interchangeable. A set of 5 rotors could be arranged in any order on the spindle, creating dozens of different starting configurations. Each rotor also had an adjustable outer ring, a ring setting, which changed its internal wiring relative to its rotational position. And then, perhaps the most powerful feature of all, was the plug board, or steckerbrett. This was a panel at the front of the machine that resembled an old-fashioned telephone switchboard. The operator was supplied with a set of cables with a plug at each end. Using these cables, they could connect pairs of letters, effectively swapping them before they even entered the rotor system. If A was plugged into F, then every time A was pressed, the machine would behave as if F had been pressed, and vice versa. With 10 such cables in use, the number of possible plugboard connections was astronomical, soaring into the trillions. The result of all these variables, the choice of rotors, their order, their ring settings, their starting positions, and the plugboard connections, was a cryptographic system of almost unimaginable scale. The total number of possible ways to set up the machine on any given day was not in the thousands, or millions, or even billions. It was a number so vast it defies easy comprehension. Approximately 158 quintillion, or 158 million. To protect this system, the German High Command issued codebooks each month, which specified the settings to be used for each day, the rotor order, the ring settings, the plugboard connections. Every operator on a given network, say the U-boat fleet in the Atlantic, would set up their machine according to the day's key. At midnight, they would destroy the old key and switch to the new one. From the German perspective, the Enigma was perfect. It was a marvel of engineering, a fortress of secrecy. They believed with absolute conviction that even if the machine itself were to be captured, the daily keys were so numerous, so complex, that it would be mathematically impossible for any adversary to work through them in time. A message would be stale, useless, long before its key could be found by brute force. This, then, was the riddle of steel that landed in the form of intercepted radio signals on the desks at Bletchley Park. It was a daily, repeating mountain to climb. The codebreakers were not just fighting a machine. They were fighting mathematics, they were fighting probability, and most of all, they were fighting the relentless, unforgiving passage of time. The mechanical enigma of the German war machine could not be defeated by a single mind, no matter how brilliant. It required a new kind of machine, one built not of steel and wire, but of human intellect, dedication, and an unprecedented level of organized collaboration. At Bletchley Park, this human machinery was assembled, a vast and intricate system of people and processes designed to dissect, analyze, and ultimately conquer the daily challenge of the Enigma code. At its operational peak during the war, the population of Bletchley Park swelled to nearly 10,000 individuals. It became one of the largest employers in the region, a secret city dedicated to a single clandestine purpose. And what was perhaps most remarkable about this population was its diversity. The old stereotypes of espionage, of suave gentleman spies, were completely absent. Instead, Station X was a cross-section of British society, a mosaic of talents drawn from every conceivable background. And crucially, over 2/3 of this workforce, the vital cogs and gears of the entire operation, were women. They came from all corners of the nation. There were the brilliant academics, the boffins and dons lured from their university cloisters, men like Alan Turing, whose genius in mathematics and logic was otherworldly. They were often eccentric, unaccustomed to military discipline and more comfortable with abstract concepts than with rigid hierarchies. They were the theoretical architects, the ones who sought the elegant, almost invisible cracks in the Enigma's logical armor. Working alongside them was a vast cadre of young women, many of them recruited into the Women's Royal Naval Service, the WWII, or the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Waterways. They were not all academics. Some were former debutantes, their nimble fingers, once accustomed to embroidery, now tasked with operating complex machinery. Some were factory workers, their resilience and stamina now essential for enduring long, monotonous shifts. Some were linguists, their knowledge of German critical for making sense of the decrypted messages. They were the operational backbone of Bletchley Park, the ones who performed the painstaking, repetitive, and utterly essential tasks that made the breakthroughs possible. Life at Station X was governed by a strict and unyielding routine. The park operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the enemy's signals never ceased. The workforce was divided into 3 8-hour shifts, ensuring that the great intellectual assault on the Enigma never paused, not even for a moment. Imagine the life of a young Wren assigned to Bletchley. Her day might begin in the pre-dawn darkness, in a cold, damp room in a billet, a private home in a nearby village that had been requisitioned for the war effort. She would dress quickly in her uniform, perhaps have a hurried breakfast of toast and tea, and then make her way to the park, often by bicycle, through the misty English countryside. Upon arrival, she would show her pass to the guard at the gate, a daily ritual that reinforced the boundary between the secret world and the ordinary one. She would then proceed to her assigned workplace, which was not the grand mansion, but one of the many numbered wooden huts that dotted the grounds. These huts were basic, functional, and often uncomfortable. They were poorly insulated, freezing in winter, and stiflingly hot in summer. They were the engine rooms of the code-breaking effort. Inside her hut, her work might involve one of 100 different specialized tasks. She could be a listener in the WWII service, spending her entire shift with headphones pressed to her ears, transcribing the Morse code signals that crackled across the airwaves from Europe. Or she might be an indexer, a human database, meticulously cross-referencing every message, every call sign, every frequency, creating a vast, complex paper library of German communication. Or she might be a Bombay operator, tending to the giant, noisy electromechanical devices that physically searched for the daily keys. The most profound aspect of this human machine was its compartmentalization. This was a central tenet of the security policy. Information was shared on a strict need-to-know basis. A woman working in Hut 6, which focused on the German Army and Air Force Enigma keys, would have absolutely no knowledge of the work being done in Hut 8, which was dedicated to the far more complex naval Enigma. They could be best friends, sharing meals in the canteen and going to local dances on their day off, but their work was a forbidden topic. They were cogs in a machine, and they were not permitted to see the machine's full design. This created an extraordinary psychological environment. These were, for the most part, young people in their late teens and early 20s, carrying the weight of a nation's secrets on their shoulders, yet unable to share that burden with anyone. They knew their work was important, they were told as much, but they could rarely see the direct results. They simply had to trust that their small, repetitive, and often tedious task was contributing to a larger, unseen victory. This human machine ran on intellect and procedure, but it was fueled by a quiet, stoic, and deeply personal sense of duty. If one could distill the essence of Bletchley Park into a single sensory experience, it would be its soundscape. It was not the sound of a typical military base. There were no marching drills, no rifle reports, no shouting sergeants. Instead, the air hummed with a different kind of industry, a unique and complex symphony of mechanical clicks, electrical whirs, and the profound, concentrated silence of the human mind at work. Let us take a slow journey through this forgotten orchestra of sounds. Our journey begins on a desolate cliff top on the coast of Kent, inside a small, isolated listening post of the WWII service. Here, the dominant sound is the raw, untamed voice of the radio itself, a constant, gentle hiss of static, like the sea whispering against the shore. Through this hiss, a young operator, perhaps a woman from the Auxiliary Territorial Service, strains to hear. Her entire world is contained within her headphone, and then it comes. A faint, rhythmic series of dits and dars, the clean metallic sound of a German Morse code transmission. The operator's hand moves swiftly, her pencil making a soft, scratching sound on the log sheet as she captures the cryptic 5-letter groups. This is the first note in our symphony, the sound of a secret being born. The captured message, a mere slip of paper, then begins its physical journey. It might be handed to a motorcycle dispatch rider. The sound now changes to the roar of a Norton or BSA engine, a stark, loud interruption in the quiet countryside, as the rider speeds along winding English lanes, battling rain and fog to deliver their precious cargo to the communications hub at Bletchley Park. Once inside the gates, the message enters a world of organized, quiet rustling. In the registration and sorting rooms, the predominant sound is that of paper. Thousands upon thousands of sheets of paper being sorted, stamped with a soft thud, filed and cross-referenced. The air is filled with the gentle, continuous whisper of paper being handled, the quiet footfalls of clerks moving between desks, and the low murmur of supervisors issuing brief, precise instructions. It is the sound of chaos being ordered, of raw data being prepared for analysis. From here, we move to the heart of the mechanical beast, the bomb huts, such as Hut 11 or Hut 11A. To step inside one of these long, low buildings was to be struck by an overwhelming wall of sound. These were not quiet places, they were factories of thought. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, powerful hum from the dozens of large cabinet-like machines. Each bomb machine was a cacophony unto itself. There was the steady, deep whir of the electric motors that drove them. Layered on top of this was the faster, almost hypnotic sound of the spinning drums, the rotors of the bomb bay, a sound like 1,000 high-speed clocks all ticking in unison. But the most defining sound was the constant, relentless, almost frantic clicking. It was the sound of thousands of electromechanical relays opening and closing, a metallic chatter that filled every corner of the room. This was the sound of the machine thinking, of it testing thousands of potential Enigma keys every minute. It was a sound that the Wren operators who tended these machines would hear in their sleep. They would listen intently to the rhythm of their machine, and any change, any falter, would be noticed immediately. And then there was the most dramatic sound of all, the loud, jarring clunk as a bomb bay came to a complete stop, signalling it had found a potential contradiction, a possible key. In that moment, the entire symphony of that one machine would cease, leaving a sudden, ringing silence that was more potent than any noise. When a viable key was found, the journey continued to the decrypt rooms. Here the atmosphere changed again. The sound was that of modified British Type-X machines, which, when set up with the correct key, could decipher the German signals. The noise was the gentle, rhythmic clatter of typewriter keys, as operators typed in the encoded gibberish and watched with a quiet sense of magic as coherent German words appeared on the page. Finally, the translated, decrypted message reached its ultimate destination, the intelligence analysis huts, like Hut 3. Here the symphony returned to an almost absolute silence. The only sounds were the turning of a page, the scratching of a pen, the soft clearing of a throat. Here, the brilliant analysts, the historians, the linguists, the classicists would pore over the raw intelligence, piecing together the vast, complex jigsaw puzzle of the German war effort. It was in this profound quiet that the true meaning of all the noise that came before was finally understood. This entire process, from the lonely Morse code signal to the final intelligence report, was a continuous, flowing symphony. It was a testament to a system where every sound, from the loudest clatter to the faintest whisper, had its place, its purpose, in the silent, secret war against the Enigma. The work conducted within the fenced-off world of Bletchley Park was never merely an academic exercise, a game of intellect played for its own sake. Every slip of paper, every successfully decrypted message was a key that unlocked a fragment of a deadly reality unfolding hundreds or thousands of miles away. The men and women of Station X were not isolated from the war. They were at its very nerve center, and they bore the psychological weight of that knowledge in a way few others could understand. Imagine being a young analyst in Hut 8, the section dedicated to the notoriously difficult naval Enigma. You spend days of intense, frustrating work searching for a breakthrough. Then, finally, it comes. A key is found, and the U-boat signals for that day become clear. On the page before you is the precise location of a wolf pack, a group of German submarines lying in wait along a convoy route in the brutal, freezing North Atlantic. You pass this information up the chain of command, knowing it will be relayed to the Admiralty in London. You know that, because of this piece of paper on your desk, a convoy of ships filled with thousands of sailors and vital supplies will be rerouted, its course altered by just enough to slip past the unseen predators lurking beneath the waves. You have, in a very real sense, just saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. Yet there is no celebration, there is no confirmation, there is no triumphant announcement. You will never know the name of the convoy, the names of the ships, or the faces of the men whose lives were spared. Your only reward is the arrival of the next batch of encoded signals, and the knowledge that the entire grueling process must begin again, immediately. The war did not pause for congratulations. Or imagine being an intelligence officer in Hut 3, piecing together information from German army signals on the Eastern Front. You read mundane reports about supply shortages, troop morale, and unit positions, but when assembled, these fragments create a complete picture of a German offensive being planned or a desperate defensive line being formed. This information allows the Allies to anticipate the enemy's moves, to exploit their weaknesses, to prepare for their attacks. The Codebreakers of Bletchley Park provided the intelligence that was critical for successes in the North African desert, in the invasion of Sicily, and, most famously, in the planning and execution of the D-Day landings in Normandy. They knew the disposition of German forces, and they knew, crucially, that Hitler had fallen for the elaborate deception plans that convinced him the main invasion would come elsewhere. This foreknowledge was a powerful weapon, but it was also a heavy burden. They were privy to the innermost secrets of the enemy, and by extension, the strategic plans of their own side. They lived with a constant, low-level tension, a background hum of anxiety that came from knowing so much, yet being able to say so little. And then, in May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. A wave of jubilation and relief swept across the Allied nations. Crowds flooded the streets of London, singing and dancing. But at Bletchley Park, the celebration was muted, tinged with a strange and solemn duty. For them, the war's end brought one final, absolute command. The order came down from the highest levels of government. The entire operation was to be erased from history. It was deemed that the methods and successes of Bletchley Park were too valuable, too sensitive to ever be made public. The secret had to be kept, even in peacetime. A great and terrible destruction began. The brilliant custom-built Bombay and Colossus machines were ordered to be dismantled, smashed into pieces and sold for scrap. Blueprints were burned, procedures were shredded, hundreds of thousands of documents, the logbooks, the decrypted messages, the intelligence reports, the very paper trail of their 6 years of secret warfare, were incinerated in a massive bonfire. The 10,000 men and women of Station X were gathered for a final time and given a stark reminder of the Official Secrets Act they had signed. They were commanded to go back to their ordinary lives and to never, under any circumstances, speak of what they had done. They were not to tell their families that they had been anything other than clerks, or mechanics, or radio operators. They were to carry the truth of their contribution to victory as a silent, personal burden for the rest of their days. Imagine the profound psychological weight of that silence. Imagine returning to civilian life, hearing people discuss the turning points of the war, knowing the secret history behind them, but being unable to utter a single word. Imagine seeing a film or reading a book about a great naval battle, knowing that the decisive factor was an intelligence breakthrough you were a part of, and remaining silent. For more than 30 years, the story of Bletchley Park was a ghost, a non-entity. The heroes of the secret war were truly invisible, their achievements buried under the heavy mantle of their sworn silence. It was their final and longest act of service to their country. In the early 1940s, even as the first successes against Enigma were beginning to bear fruit, a small group of analysts at Bletchley Park noticed a different kind of German radio signal. It was distinct. It did not use Morse code. It was an encrypted teleprinter stream transmitted at high speed. The listeners codenamed this traffic fish. and the most important of these signals, believed to carry the highest level communications, they nicknamed tunny. For a long time, tunny was an impenetrable wall. The cryptanalysts had no idea what kind of machine produced it or on what principles it operated. It was just a stream of meaningless noise, a random jumble of text, but it was being transmitted between the highest echelons of command, meaning that within that noise lay the thoughts and orders of Hitler himself. To break it would be to change the war. The first break came on August 30th, 1941, in a moment of extraordinary carelessness by a German operator. A long message of nearly 4,000 characters was sent, but due to a transmission error, the recipient requested it be sent again. The operator retyped the entire message but made two fatal mistakes. First, he reset the cipher machine to the exact same initial settings, a forbidden practice. Second, in retyping, he used slightly different, more familiar abbreviations, for instance changing Sprutchnummer, message number, to Sprutch. This meant that Bletchley Park now possessed two long, nearly identical, but not quite, ciphertext messages that had been encrypted with the very same key. For a cryptanalyst, this was a gift from the heavens. The task of deciphering this pair of messages fell to a brilliant and patient mathematician named John Tiltman. For weeks he worked meticulously, comparing the two streams of ciphertext. By analysing the subtle differences, he was able to deduce the original plain text of both messages and, more importantly, he was able to reconstruct the stream of random characters, or key, that the German machine had used to encrypt them. It was an astonishing achievement, but it was only the first step. Now they had the key, but they still did not know what machine had produced it. That key stream, a long sequence of seemingly random characters, was given to a gifted young chemist named Bill Tutt. His job was to look at this key stream and attempt to reverse engineer the logical structure of the machine that created it, a machine he had never seen. Imagine that task. It is like being given a single sentence from a book and being asked to describe the entire printing press that produced it. For months, Tutt stared at long sheets of paper covered in characters, searching for patterns, for repetitions, for any sign of a hidden structure. In an act of pure logical deduction that is considered one of the greatest feats of cryptanalysis, Tutt succeeded. He deduced that the German machine, later identified as the Lorenz SZ42 cipher machine, had a complex architecture of 12 rotating wheels, far more intricate than Enigma's 3 or 4. They had grasped the logical structure of the monster, but a practical problem remained. Every day, the German operators changed the starting positions of these 12 wheels. Finding the correct settings by hand was an immensely time-consuming task, nearly impossible to do in time for the intelligence to be useful. They needed a machine to beat a machine. The need for a machine that could automate the process of finding the Lorenz machine's settings led to a series of experimental devices at Bletchley Park. The first was a machine nicknamed Heath Robinson, after the cartoonist famous for drawing absurdly complex contraptions. Heath Robinson used high-speed paper tapes to compare the ciphertext message against possible keys generated by a Lorenz simulation. It was somewhat effective, but it was slow and notoriously unreliable. The paper tapes would frequently break or lose synchronization, causing endless frustration for the operators. It was clear a more radical solution was needed. The problem was presented to a brilliant post office telephone engineer named Tommy Flowers. Flowers was an expert in vacuum tubes, the fragile glass valves that were the precursors to the transistor. He listened to the problems of Heath Robinson's unreliable paper tapes and made a bold, almost heretical proposal. He suggested getting rid of the moving, mechanical parts altogether. He wanted to build a machine that was fully electronic. His idea was met with deep skepticism. The leadership at Bletchley Park did not believe that a machine built with hundreds, let alone thousands of fragile vacuum tubes could possibly be reliable enough to do any useful work. The tubes were notorious for burning out. But Flowers, a man of quiet confidence in his own abilities, persisted. He knew that if the machine was never turned off, the vacuum tubes would be far more stable and reliable. When Bletchley Park hesitated, Flowers decided to take matters into his own hands. He and his team at the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill began building this mammoth machine, funding much of it themselves. It was a commitment of immense risk and patriotism. Imagine the scene in their workshop, tens of thousands of wires being meticulously soldered, steel racks being erected to hold complex circuit boards, and most importantly, 1,500 vacuum tubes being carefully installed. The machine took shape, looking like nothing the world had ever seen. It was the size of a small room, over 7 feet high and 16 feet long. It had no visible rotating wheels or moving parts. It was a silent wall of panels, wires, and glass tubes. When switched on, it would glow with a warm light, emit a gentle hum, and give off a considerable amount of heat. They called it Colossus. The Colossus Mark I was dismantled and transported in secret to Bletchley Park in early 1944. It was reassembled in H Block. The operators, mostly women of the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENS, were trained to use it. They would prepare a loop of paper tape containing the tunny ciphertext, but instead of being read mechanically, Colossus would read it using a beam of light, an optical reader that could process 5,000 characters per second. The data from the tape was then fed into the massive electronic processor of Colossus. Inside, logic circuits formed by the vacuum tubes would perform millions of calculations per second, simulating the wheels of the Lorenz machine and testing possible settings at an unimaginable speed. The first day it was tested was the moment of truth. The tape was loaded, the switches were thrown, the vacuum tubes glowed, and in a matter of hours, far faster than anyone had dared hope, Colossus produced the correct settings for the day. It had worked. Tommy Flowers and his audacious proposal had been spectacularly vindicated. Colossus revolutionized the breaking of tunny. It could do in hours what had previously taken weeks. Its success immediately led to the construction of an improved version, Colossus Mark II, with 2,400 vacuum tubes and operating 5 times faster. By the end of the war, 10 Colossus machines were working at full capacity at Bletchley Park, providing an invaluable stream of intelligence from the very highest levels of the German command. The impact of Colossus on the war effort was immense. The intelligence gathered from the tunny decrypts, which was given the codename Ultra, provided Allied leaders with an unprecedented window into the minds of the German High Command. They could read Hitler's discussions with his generals. They knew the German assessments of Allied strength and intentions. They knew about troop movements, planned offensives, and the state of German supplies and morale. This intelligence was particularly crucial in the months leading up to and during the D-Day landings in June 1944. Thanks to Colossus, the Allies knew for certain that their deception efforts, Operation Fortitude, had succeeded. They knew that the Germans believed the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. This certainty gave the Allied commanders, particularly General Eisenhower, the confidence to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history, knowing that their enemy was looking in the wrong direction. Colossus was not just a technical marvel, it was a strategic weapon that saved countless lives and helped ensure the success of the most decisive day of the war in Europe. But the story of Colossus has a sad and secret ending, much like that of Bletchley Park itself. After the war was over, an order was given. Like the Bombay machines, the 10 Colossus machines were also to be destroyed. They were dismantled, their parts broken up, and their blueprints, circuit diagrams, and engineering notes were all burned. Winston Churchill, who knew the value of Bletchley Park better than anyone, ordered that the existence of these machines must remain a state secret of the highest order. The reasoning was clear. The Cold War was beginning, and the British did not want their potential adversaries to know the extent of their ability to break complex cipher systems. The consequence of this secrecy was profound. Tommy Flowers and his fellow engineers were written out of history. They had invented and built what many now consider to be the world's first programmable electronic computer, years before more famous machines like ENIAC in the United States. But they could not speak of it. They could not publish their work. They could not receive the recognition they so richly deserved. For 30 years, the world believed the story of the computer began elsewhere. The history of the digital dawn was written with a crucial chapter missing. It was only in the 1970s and beyond, as documents began to be declassified, that the true story of Colossus began to emerge. Today, a fully working reconstruction of a Colossus Mark II stands in the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, on the very site of the old H block. It stands as a physical reminder of a lost chapter of technological history. The hum of its vacuum tubes and the flicker of its running paper tape are a tribute to the quiet genius of Tommy Flowers and the dedication of the Wrens who operated it. The story of Colossus is a lesson in innovation born of necessity and of the price of secrecy. It is a legacy that was long forgotten, a giant that helped win a war and usher in a new age. Before vanishing into the shadows, its existence merely a whisper in the memories of a chosen few. Prior to December 7, 1941, the United States Navy's code-breaking efforts were divided among three primary locations. There was Station Cast in the Philippines, Station Negus in Washington, D.C., and Station Hypo in Hawaii, named for the naval phonetic alphabets Hi. Hypo, located in the basement of the administration building at the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard, was an uncomfortable place to work. It was cramped, poorly ventilated, and often referred to by the analysts as the dungeon. The head of Hypo was one of the most singular characters in the history of cryptanalysis, Commander Joseph J. Rochefort. Rochefort was not your typical naval officer. He was eccentric, highly intuitive, and often worked in a worn smoking jacket and slippers instead of his uniform. He was a Japan expert, having spent years there as a naval attaché, and he had a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the Japanese naval mindset. His team was a small group of cryptographers and linguists, many of whom were members of the naval band, as it was believed that musicians had a good ear for pattern recognition. They worked on JN-25, the primary operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Like Enigma, JN-25 was a complex system, but it worked on a different principle. It was a two-part code system. First, words and phrases were replaced by 5-digit number groups from a massive. Then, a second layer of encryption was applied, in which these number groups were added to random numbers from a separate additive book. To read a message, you needed both books, the main code book and the additive book for that particular day. Before Pearl Harbor, progress on breaking JN-25 was slow. The Americans had reconstructed parts of the codebook, but they had a long way to go. After the attack, everything changed. A sense of desperate urgency descended upon Hypo. Rochefort and his team began working around the clock, often sleeping on cots in their office, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and a burning desire for retribution and to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. Their work was incredibly laborious. It involved sifting through thousands of intercepted messages, looking for repeated patterns in the 5-digit number groups. It was a process of traffic analysis and crib solving. They would identify patterns that might indicate a specific word or phrase. For example, if the same sequence of numbers always appeared in messages sent to aircraft carriers, it might mean aircraft carrier. It was a process of reconstructing a massive dictionary, one word at a time, from scratch. Rochefort fostered a unique working environment. He believed in intuition and creativity as much as in logic. He encouraged his team to think like the Japanese. He would post large maps of the Pacific on the walls and try to visualize the enemy's next moves. His stuffy basement was not just a code-breaking factory, it was a center for psychological analysis, a place where Americans tried to get inside the minds of their opponents. Under his unorthodox leadership and under the constant pressure of the war, the Hypo team began to make significant progress, managing to decipher about 10 to 15% of each JN-25 message. It wasn't much, but it began to give them a dim view, a shadow, of Japanese naval intentions. In the spring of 1942, those shadows began to coalesce into an alarming picture. The codebreakers at Hypo began to notice a surge in messages referring to a major upcoming Japanese operation. Keywords like attack, invasion force, and carriers appeared with increasing frequency. It was clear that Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese fleet, was planning a decisive blow intended to annihilate the remainder of the US Pacific Fleet. But where was the target? The messages consistently referred to a location codenamed AF. Identifying what AF stood for became the highest priority, a question that could determine the survival of American naval power in the Pacific. The analysts in Washington at Station Nagus had their own theories. Based on traffic analysis, they believed AF was likely somewhere in the South Pacific, or perhaps even the US West Coast. But Rochefort and his team at Hypo had a different hunch. Based on their understanding of Japanese strategy and subtle clues in the messages, Rochefort was convinced that AF was the Midway Atoll. Midway was a tiny strategic island, America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. Taking it would allow the Japanese to directly threaten Hawaii. To Rochefort, it made perfect strategic sense for Yamamoto. But a hunch was not proof. Admiral Nimitz, the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty before he could risk his few precious remaining aircraft carriers. This is when Rochefort and his team devised one of the most brilliant deceptions in intelligence history. If they could not definitively prove AF was Midway, they would get the Japanese to tell them. The plan was simple. They instructed the American base on Midway to send out an unencrypted radio message, using a channel they knew the Japanese were monitoring. The message, disguised as a routine communication, stated that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that they were running low on fresh water. It was a gamble. They hoped that Japanese listening posts would intercept this message and report it up their chain of command. If Rochefort was right, then a JN-25 encrypted message would soon be sent across the Japanese network, stating that AF is short on water. The Hypo team waited in suspense. 2 days passed, and then it came. A US listening post intercepted a short JN-25 message. It was rushed to the dungeon at Pearl Harbor. The codebreakers set to work. Though they could not decrypt the entire message, they could decipher enough. The key words came through, clear as day. AF, water, shortage. Rochefort had been right. AF was Midway. The gamble had paid off. Admiral Nimitz now had the certainty he needed. He knew his enemy's objective, and he could plan a trap. With the certain knowledge that the Japanese fleet was steaming towards Midway, Admiral Nimitz had an invaluable advantage. He knew exactly where to concentrate his forces. He gathered all of his available aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet, and sent them to ambush the Japanese force. In early June 1942, the battle was joined. The Japanese fleet, under the command of Admiral Nagumo, approached Midway, completely unaware that the Americans knew their every move. They launched an airstrike against the island, but they were surprised by the strength of the American defenses. While the Japanese planes were rearming on the decks of their carriers after the first strike, American dive bombers launched from the carriers hiding over the horizon struck. The moment was one of the most decisive of the war. In the space of a few catastrophic minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were hit and turned into burning infernos. Later that day, the 4th, the Hiru, was also sunk. It was a stunning victory, an almost unbelievable reversal of fortune. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world just 6 months earlier, had lost the backbone of its carrier fleet in a single day. The Battle of Midway halted Japanese expansion in the Pacific and marked the turning point of the war. that victory would have been impossible without the quiet, laborious work of Rochefort and his team in their stuffy basement at Pearl Harbor. They had given Nimitz the most powerful weapon of all, foreknowledge. But Rochefort's story, like that of Tommy Flowers, did not end with accolades and parades. Due to inter-service rivalries and professional jealousy, particularly from his counterparts in Washington, the contribution of Rochefort and the HYPO team was downplayed and ignored. Instead of being decorated, Rochefort was moved out of codebreaking and assigned to a non-critical post. For many years, the decisive role of intelligence in the Battle of Midway was unknown to the public. The story that was told was one of pilot bravery and good luck. While those things were certainly true, they were not the whole story. The foundations of the victory had been laid by men who fought a different kind of war, a war of logic, intuition, and endless persistence. It was only many years later that the central role of Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers was fully recognized. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 10 years after his death. It was a belated acknowledgement for the eccentric, smoking jacket-wearing man whose mind had helped save the Pacific Fleet and change the course of history from a windowless basement in paradise. For the thousands of young men and women who were brought to Bletchley Park, life was defined by a relentless rhythm, the rhythm of the shifts, the day shift, the evening shift, the night shift. Every 8 hours a new wave of people would pour through the gates as another weary wave departed. The machine never slept, and so its operators rarely had a true rest. Imagine being a young woman, perhaps only 20 years old, on the night shift. You cycle through the blacked-out lanes of the Buckinghamshire countryside, guided only by the faint shielded glow of your bicycle lamp. As you arrive at the park, the silence of the night is broken by the distant hum of machinery and the light spilling from the curtained windows of the huts. Inside, the air is thick with fatigue and the smell of cheap coffee. You would take over from a bleary-eyed colleague who would give a brief, whispered summary of what had happened in the past 8 hours, and then you would begin your work, perhaps sitting before a Bombay machine, listening to its familiar clicking cadence, or perhaps at a long table sorting through seemingly endless stacks of paper. The monotony could be mind-numbing. Much of the work was incredibly repetitive, yet it demanded absolute concentration. A single mistake, a single digit transcribed incorrectly, could waste hours of work for dozens of other people. The pressure to be perfect was constant. The food in the canteen was basic and often uninspiring, typical wartime rationing, but it was a place to socialize, a place for a brief respite from the tension of the huts. It was here, in the long queues for watery stew or suet pudding, that friendships were formed. People would talk about anything and everything except their work. They would talk about films, about their families back home, about the dances at the village hall. They created a veneer of normality to protect themselves from the extraordinary reality of what they were doing. Life outside of work also existed, though it was limited. The people of Bletchley Park formed their own clubs. There was a dramatic society, the Bletchley Park Amateur Dramatic and Theatrical Society, which staged plays to entertain their colleagues. There was a choir, a music club, and even a hockey team. These activities were more than just recreation. And there was romance. In this high-pressure, secret environment where young people worked in close proximity, it was inevitable that relationships would blossom. Secret rendezvous by the lake, hurried hand-holding in a darkened corridor, marriages planned for an uncertain post-war future. But even in love, the secrecy held. A husband and wife might work in different sections and never be able to discuss what they had done during their day. They shared their lives, but not their biggest secret. This rhythm of daily life, this oscillation between intense monotony and precious moments of normality, was what sustained these people. It was the framework upon which their individual stories of sacrifice, friendship, and love were woven. We cannot underestimate the psychological burden carried by those who worked at Bletchley Park. It took many forms. There was the physical exhaustion of the long shifts and the harsh working conditions, But the mental and emotional fatigue ran even deeper. Consider the weight of knowledge. The senior intelligence analysts were not just reading abstract messages, they were reading about upcoming attacks, about convoys sailing into traps, about cities scheduled to be bombed. Sometimes they had information about an imminent danger but could not act on it, because to do so would reveal to the Germans that their codes had been broken. The decision to sacrifice some in order to protect the greater secret and thus save more lives in the long run was a terrible moral burden. There are stories, though difficult to verify, of codebreakers knowing in advance of an air raid on a city where their own families lived and having to sit in helpless silence. For the thousands of junior staff, the burden was different. It was the burden of not knowing. They knew their work was vital, but they could not see the big picture. They were cogs in a vast machine without understanding its ultimate function. This lack of context, combined with the repetitiveness of the work, could lead to feelings of futility and disconnection. And overarching everything was the pressure of secrecy. The inability to share one's experiences, fears, and successes with loved ones created a profound form of isolation. Many Bletchley veterans would later speak of feeling as if they were living a double life, and of the distance that the secrecy created between them and the outside world. To cope, they developed their own mechanisms. Humor was an essential tool. They created nicknames, in-jokes, and satirical poems about their work and their colleagues. They found comedy in the absurdity of their daily lives. One famous story tells of a codebreaker who would cover his pet parrot's cage with a cloth whenever he worked at home, for fear the parrot might learn and repeat state secret. Professionalism and a focus on the task at hand was also a defense mechanism. By concentrating entirely on the logical puzzle before them, they could temporarily push away the larger, more frightening implications of the work. It was a way of compartmentalizing the mind, of separating the intellectual labor from the emotional toll. The friendships formed at Bletchley Park were incredibly strong, precisely because they were forged in such a high-pressure environment. Your colleagues were the only people in the world who understood even a fraction of what you were going through. They may not have known the details of your work, but they knew the rhythm of the shifts, the fatigue, and the need for discretion. A sympathetic nod, a shared cup of tea, a quiet word of encouragement. These small gestures meant the world. They were a reminder that you were not alone in this world of shadows. When the war ended and Bletchley Park was shuttered, 10,000 individual stories were scattered to the winds. For decades, those stories remained untold. The vow of silence was kept with remarkable fidelity. Husbands and wives never knew each other's true roles in the war. Children grew up without ever knowing their parents had been heroes. But as the secrets were finally allowed to be revealed in the late 20th century, the stories began to emerge, like spring flowers through melting snow. The veterans, now in their old age, were at last able to share their experiences. There is the story of Mavis Lever, a young woman who discovered a crucial flaw in the Italian intelligence cipher, leading to a major naval victory in the Mediterranean. She met her husband, Keith Beatty, a mathematician who also worked there, and they kept their respective work secret from each other for years. There is the story of Jane Hughes, who worked on the Colossus machine. She described the sense of awe and power at seeing the massive machine in action, and the sadness of seeing it destroyed after the war. She took her vow of silence so seriously that even her husband only learned of her work when he saw a documentary about it on television in the 1990s. And there are the stories of personal tragedy. The story of Alan Turing, one of the great minds behind Bletchley's success, who was later prosecuted for his homosexuality and subjected to cruel treatment by the very country he had helped to save. The silence that shrouded his wartime work meant that no one could defend him by revealing his true importance. His tragedy is a painful reminder of the price of secrecy and the injustice of the era. As we listen to these individual stories, Bletchley Park ceases to be an abstract place of machines and codes. It becomes a human place, a place of resilience, of laughter in the face of stress, of friendships forged in the most difficult circumstances, and of a quiet sacrifice that lasted a lifetime. The true legacy of Bletchley Park lies not just in the battles won or the war shortened. It lies in the 10,000 lives that were touched and forever changed by the years they spent in that secret world. Tonight, as we drift off to sleep, let us remember them, not as anonymous codebreakers, but as people in all their complexity, courage, and humanity. Let the peace of their stories bring peace to you. By 1943, the tide of the war in Europe was slowly but perceptibly turning. The Allies had achieved a major victory in North Africa, and now their strategic gaze turned towards the continent of Europe itself. The question was not if they would invade, but where. Winston Churchill famously referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe. But the most logical stepping stone to Italy was the large, strategically vital island of Sicily. The problem was that this logic was not a secret. The German High Command was not foolish. They too could look at a map. They knew that Sicily was the obvious next target for an Allied invasion, and they were reinforcing it heavily with troops, tanks, and aircraft. A direct head-on assault on a well-defended Sicily would be a bloodbath, costing tens of thousands of Allied lives. The Allied planners faced a monumental challenge. How could they convince the Germans to look the other way? How could they make the most powerful military minds in the world believe a lie? They needed a deception, but not just any deception. They needed something so audacious, so detailed, and so utterly convincing that it would cause the Germans to move their best troops away from the real target. The idea for what would become Operation Mincemeat was born in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of British naval intelligence. It was inspired by a memo written by a young intelligence officer named Ian Fleming, the same Ian Fleming who would later create James Bond. The memo, known as the Trout Memo, listed a series of outlandish ideas for deceiving the enemy, one of which was the suggestion of planting misleading papers on a dead body. This seemingly macabre and far-fetched idea was seized upon by two brilliant and eccentric intelligence officers, Ewan Montague, a naval officer and lawyer, and Charles Chumley, an RAF officer. They believed that if they could find a body, create a completely fictitious but utterly believable identity for it, and have it wash ashore in a neutral but pro-German country like Spain, the Germans would find the secret documents in its possession and believe they had stumbled upon the intelligence coup of a lifetime. The plan was as intricate as a novel, and its success depended on getting every single tiny detail absolutely perfect. The first and most somber step was to acquire a body. It had to be the body of a man who appeared to have died by drowning at sea, and crucially, one with no family who would come looking for him. Through a quiet arrangement with a London coroner, they obtained the body of a homeless man named Blind Michael, who had recently died after ingesting rat poison. His tragic, anonymous death was about to be given a profound, secret purpose. The man who had been no one in life was about to become the most important man who never was. With the grim foundation of their plan in place, Montague and Chumley embarked on the most creative phase of their operation, the birth of a fictional character. This was not just about creating a name, it was about creating a life. They needed to build a persona so real, so detailed, that any German intelligence officer examining his effects would have no doubt that he was a genuine person. They named him Captain Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The rank was carefully chosen, senior enough to be entrusted with sensitive documents, but not so senior that his non-existence would be easily discovered. He was given a birth date, an address, and a military ID card, complete with a photograph. The man in the photograph was, in fact, another intelligence officer who bore a passing resemblance to the deceased. The most critical element was the pocket litter, the small, everyday items that a person carries with them, the things that tell the story of their life. Montague and Chumley approached this task with the meticulous care of novelists. They wrote love letters to Major Martin from his fictional fiancée, Pam. The letters were written on proper stationery with real ink, and they spoke of love, of future plans, of small worries and daily tenderness. To make them even more authentic, they were written by a female clerk in their office, creating a believable handwriting and tone. They included a photograph of Pam, who was, in reality, another MI5 clerk. They added 2 ticket stubs from a recent London theatre show, a receipt for a new shirt, and a stern letter from his bank manager about a small overdraft. A touch of human imperfection to make him more real. They even included a receipt for an engagement ring. Every item was carefully chosen to build a picture of a real man, with a real life, a real love, and real minor financial troubles. The centerpiece of the deception, of course, was the official correspondence he was carrying. This was contained in a briefcase which would be chained to his wrist. Inside were carefully fabricated personal letters between high-ranking Allied generals designed to be found and read. The letters contained subtle, off-the-record hints and allusions that the main Allied invasion target was not Sicily at all, but Greece and Sardinia. The deception was layered, designed to feel like a casual, almost careless exchange between old friends, which would make it seem all the more authentic to the German intelligence analysts who would eventually read it. Every detail was considered. The documents were written and signed by the actual generals. The paper was the correct type. The ink was tested. The briefcase was of a standard regulation issue. The final touch was an eyelash placed inside one of the key letters. If the letter was opened and read, the eyelash would likely fall out, and its absence would tell the British, if they ever recovered the documents, that their deception had been seen. Once Major Martin's life had been fully constructed, the body of Blind Michael was dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marine. The pockets were filled with the carefully crafted litter of his life. The briefcase was chained to his wrist. He was no longer a forgotten man in a London morgue. He was Major William Martin, a king's messenger, carrying the fate of the Allied invasion with him on his final silent journey. The final phase of Operation Mincemeat was the most delicate of all. Major Martin's body had to be delivered to the coast of Spain in a way that would appear natural. It couldn't simply be dropped from a plane. It had to look as though he had been a passenger on a plane that had crashed at sea, and that his body had then drifted ashore. In the pre-dawn hours of April 30th, 1943, a British submarine, HMS Seraph, surfaced quietly off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain. The location was carefully chosen. It was known to be an area with a very active and efficient German intelligence agent. On the deck of the submarine, Ewan Montague and Charles Chumley gently lowered the body of Major Martin into the cold sea. They had kept it preserved in a special steel canister filled with dry ice. As they released him into the water, they recited the 39th Psalm, a quiet, somber farewell to the man they had created and to the anonymous soul who had made their plan possible. The submarine then slipped back beneath the waves and disappeared. Now began a period of agonizing suspense. Would the body be found? Would it wash ashore where they intended? And most importantly, would the Spanish authorities, who were officially neutral but leaned towards the Axis, hand over the documents to the Germans? The body was discovered as hoped by a local Spanish fisherman. The news slowly made its way up the chain of Spanish command. British naval attachés in Spain put on a show of desperate anxiety, demanding the immediate return of the briefcase, stressing its importance, a piece of theatre designed to make the Germans even more eager to see what was inside. For days, the intelligence officers in London waited, monitoring German communications that had been decrypted at Bletchley Park. They needed to know if the bait had been taken. Then, the evidence began to filter through. First, a message indicating that the Spanish had allowed the Germans to examine the contents of the briefcase. Then, more significantly, decrypts of German high command messages showed a dramatic shift in thinking. The intelligence from Major Martin's letters was being taken seriously. Hitler himself was convinced. Panzer divisions were moved from France to Greece. Torpedo boats were redeployed to the Greek islands. German reconnaissance flights over Sicily were reduced, while those over Greece and Sardinia were increased. The deception had worked more perfectly than its creators had ever dared to dream. On July 10, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. They were met with far lighter resistance than they had anticipated. The German and Italian defenders had been caught off guard, their attention diverted eastward. The island was captured far more quickly and with far fewer casualties than the military planners had feared. The man who never was, the fictional Major William Martin, had achieved a victory as significant as any general. His silent voyage had saved thousands of lives and helped secure a crucial foothold for the Allies in Europe. It remains one of the most brilliant, creative and successful deception operations in the history of warfare, a masterpiece of intrigue born in the quiet back rooms of British intelligence. Our final story in this series takes us away from the analytical hubs of Bletchley Park and Pearl Harbor, away from the grand strategic deceptions planned in London. We travel instead into the heart of enemy-occupied territory, into a world of whispered conversations, clandestine meetings, and the constant chilling fear of betrayal and capture. This is a story not of code breaking, but of espionage, of the human art of resistance, and its central figure is one of the most remarkable and unlikely spies of the Second World War, an American woman named Virginia Hall. What made Virginia Hall so unlikely was not just her gender or her nationality, but a physical characteristic that, in the unforgiving world of espionage, should have been a crippling disadvantage. Virginia Hall had a prosthetic leg. As a young woman, she had suffered a severe hunting accident and her left leg had to be amputated below the knee. She wore a heavy, somewhat clumsy wooden prosthesis, which she had nicknamed Cuthbert. It caused her to walk with a noticeable limp. Her dream had always been to join the American Foreign Service, to become a diplomat. But in the 1930s, the State Department had a strict policy against hiring anyone with a physical disability. Her ambition was thwarted by bureaucracy. Undeterred, Virginia was in France when the war broke out, and she drove an ambulance for the French army until the country fell to the Germans in 1940. She escaped to London, filled with a burning desire to continue the fight against Nazism. It was in London that her path crossed with a new, secret British organisation, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. The SOE's purpose, as mandated by Winston Churchill, was to set Europe ablaze. Its job was to train and dispatch agents into occupied countries to work with local resistance groups, to conduct sabotage and to gather intelligence. The SOE was not looking for traditional diplomats or soldiers. They were looking for people with courage, resourcefulness, and a mastery of languages. Virginia Hall, with her fluent French and her fierce determination, was a perfect candidate. Her limp, which the State Department had seen as a liability, the SOE saw as a potential asset. It made her memorable, yes, but it also made her seem harmless, an unlikely suspect. In August of 1941, after undergoing the SOE's rigorous training in everything from silent killing and explosives to radio operation and propaganda, Virginia Hall became the first female agent to be sent into France. She parachuted not into the country, but arrived by boat, her prosthetic leg making a parachute jump too dangerous. She arrived in Lyon with a simple mission: to make contact with the fledgling French resistance, to assess their needs, and to help build them into an effective fighting force. She had a code name, Marie, and a small amount of money. The rest was up to her. Virginia Hall arrived in a France that was gripped by fear and suspicion. The German Gestapo and the collaborationist French milice were everywhere. Neighbours informed on neighbours. A foreign accent or a careless word could mean arrest, torture, and death. Into this atmosphere of darkness, Virginia, posing as a journalist for the New York Post, began to weave her network. She was a masterful organiser. She moved quietly through the city of Lyon, using a variety of disguises, changing her appearance, her hair colour, her mannerisms. She was methodical and cautious. She found safe houses, recruited contacts, and established communication lines. She proved to be incredibly adept at judging character, at knowing who to trust, in a world where betrayal was a constant threat. Her primary role was to act as a coordinator and a facilitator for the resistance. She was the vital link between the scattered resistance groups on the ground and the SOE headquarters in London. Using a heavy, cumbersome wireless radio set, which she had to move constantly to avoid detection, she would transmit requests for supplies, weapons, explosives, money, and coordinate nighttime parachute drops in remote fields. Imagine the tension of those nights. Waiting in a dark, cold field, listening for the drone of an Allied plane, ready to flash a pre-arranged signal with a torch. Then, the frantic work of gathering the dropped canisters and hiding them before a German patrol might stumble upon them. Virginia Hall organized and oversaw dozens of these dangerous operations. She built a wide and varied network of agents around her, which she called Heckler. It included everyone from railway workers and doctors to printers, and even the owner of a local brothel who could gather intelligence from her German clients. Virginia became the central hub, the quiet American woman to whom everyone reported. She arranged for downed Allied airmen to be smuggled to safety across the Spanish border. She organized acts of sabotage against railway lines and factories. She was, in effect, running a one-woman intelligence and resistance operation in the heart of Vichy France. Her success did not go unnoticed by the enemy. The Gestapo began to hear whispers of a mysterious and highly effective female agent. They did not know her name or her nationality, but they knew of her work. They gave her their own code name, Artemis. And they also noted the one distinguishing feature that was sometimes reported. This agent, they were told, is the most dangerous of all Allied spies. We must find and destroy her. They also referred to her as the Limping Lady. Klaus Barbie, the infamous butcher of Lyon, the head of the Gestapo in the region, was said to have been personally obsessed with her capture, reportedly screaming at his subordinates, "I would give anything to get my hands on that limping Canadian bitch." As Virginia's network grew in effectiveness, the danger around her intensified. The Gestapo's net began to tighten. Safe houses were raided and members of her network were arrested and tortured. In November of 1942, the situation became untenable. The Germans invaded the rest of France, ending the partial autonomy of the Vichy regime and making Lyon an even more dangerous place. Her SOE controller in London sent her a stark message. It was time to leave. But escape was not simple. The borders were heavily guarded. Her only viable route was a long and treacherous journey on foot, south over the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. For any able-bodied person, this was a formidable challenge, especially in the harsh winter weather. For Virginia Hall, with her prosthetic leg, it was almost unthinkable. The journey was an ordeal of pure endurance. She trekked for days through deep snow and freezing temperatures, her prosthetic leg, Cuthbert, chafing and causing her immense pain. At one point, she sent a wireless message to London, complaining that Cuthbert was proving troublesome on the journey. Her handlers in London, not realizing that Cuthbert was her leg, sent back a reply that has become legendary for its stiff upper lip absurdity. "If Cuthbert giving you trouble, have him eliminated." Despite the agony, she made it. She crossed the border into Spain, only to be promptly arrested by the Spanish authorities for illegal entry. She spent 6 weeks in a Spanish prison before the American embassy, alerted to her plight, was able to secure her release. Most people would have considered their duty done, but Virginia Hall was not most people. She made her way back to London, but instead of resting, she immediately began looking for a way to return to the fight. The SOE, believing her cover was blown and that her limp made her too recognizable, refused to send her back to France. So Virginia joined the newly formed American intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The OSS recognized her incredible skill and courage and agreed to send her back. In 1944, she returned to France, this time disguised as an elderly peasant woman. She dyed her hair grey, had her teeth ground down to look older, and shuffled with a stoop to disguise her limp. Working in central France, she armed and trained several battalions of French resistance fighters or maquisards. She became a brilliant guerrilla leader, teaching them how to conduct ambushes, sabotage bridges, and disrupt German supply lines in the crucial weeks and months following the D-Day landings. Her forces were so effective that they tied down thousands of German troops who otherwise would have been sent to fight the main Allied advance from Normandy. After the war, Virginia Hall's incredible service was recognized. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman to receive it in World War II. In a ceremony at the White House, President Truman wanted to give her a public award, but Virginia, true to her nature, insisted that the ceremony be private, as she was still operational and most anxious to get on with her work. She went on to have a long career with the CIA, a quiet pioneer in a world dominated by men. Her story remains one of the most inspiring of the entire war, a testament to the fact that courage, intelligence, and an unbreakable will are far more powerful than any physical limitation. And so, for decades, the story of Bletchley Park dissolved back into the English mist from whence it came. The grand mansion, stripped of its secret purpose, went through a series of mundane new lives, becoming a teacher training college, a local post office headquarters. The remaining huts fell into disrepair, their wooden planks rotting, their windows clouded with dust and neglect. The vibrant secret city of 10,000 mines simply vanished, its energy dissipated, its memory locked away in the heart of those who had been there. The world moved on, and the official histories of the Second World War were written, filled with tales of battlefield bravery and strategic genius, with no mention of the quiet intellectual war won within the confines of Station X. It was not until the mid-1000s, 970s, when the veil of secrecy was finally, partially lifted, that the first whispers of the truth began to emerge. Former staff, now in their old age, were finally permitted to speak. Books began to be written, documentaries were filmed, slowly, painstakingly. The true scale and significance of what had been achieved at Bletchley Park began to dawn on a world that had been utterly oblivious. The story that emerged was one that challenged our very understanding of history. It taught us that the narrative of the past is often incomplete, that there are silent currents running deep beneath the surface of great events. It revealed that some of the most decisive actions are not loud, explosive, or violent, but are instead quiet, cerebral, and hidden from view. The legacy of Bletchley Park is twofold. There is the tangible legacy. It is estimated that the intelligence produced there shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving countless millions of lives. The work done on machines like the Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer, laid the foundational groundwork for the digital age we now inhabit. But there is also a more profound, more human legacy. It is the story of collaboration on an unprecedented scale, of people from all walks of life putting aside their differences to work towards a common goal. It is a testament to the power of human ingenuity, persistence, and intellectual courage in the face of a seemingly impossible problem. And above all, it is a poignant memorial to the quiet, uncelebrated heroism of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things and then to carry the weight of that achievement in total selfless silence. Tonight, as we conclude our journey, let us rest in the quiet contemplation of their story. Think of the thousands of lives lived in secret dedication, of the immense burden they carried so that others could live in freedom. The world owes them a debt that can never truly be repaid, but we can honor them by remembering their silent service. Let the quiet heroism of Bletchley Park be a soothing presence in your mind. Let the echoes of the clicking machines and the whispered secrets fade into a gentle rhythmic hum. Let the weight of their silence be a comforting blanket, allowing you to let go of your own worldly concerns. May the knowledge of their quiet, steadfast duty bring you a sense of deep and profound peace. Rest now, sleep well.